Femi, okay, welcome to the stream. On today's episode, we are going to be looking at Iran-US relations. Back in 2018, the then President Donald Trump, he withdrew from an international nuclear accord with Iran. Now President Biden is saying that he is ready to revisit the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, but with conditions. Iran's take? Well, this is Iran's Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif earlier on this week talking to state TV. Have a listen.
Nothing has changed. Biden claims that Trump's policy of maximum pressure was maximum failure. Blinken also just recently said that that policy failed. But for all practical purposes, they're pursuing the same policy. They haven't changed that policy. The problem in the United States, and it doesn't matter which administration, the Islamic Republic now has dealt with 7 consecutive US presidents, and I have dealt with almost 5 of them. And the problem is, US is addicted to sanctions. US is addicted to pressure. US is addicted to bullying.
So is President Joe Biden the man to cool tensions between the US and Iran? I have an excellent lineup for you. Hello, Jason. Hello, Asal. Hello, Setare. I'm going to get them to say hello to you and introduce themselves. Jason, tell everybody who you are and what you do.
Hi, Femi. Great to be on the program. Thanks for having me. I am Jason Blazakis. I am a senior research fellow at the Soufan Center.
Good to have you. Hello, Asal. Introduce yourself to our global audience.
Hi, Femi. Thank you for having me as well. My name is Asal Rad, and I am a senior research fellow at the National Iranian American Council.
Good to have you. Setare, nice to see you. Tell everybody who you are and what you do.
Thank you for having me. I'm Setare Sadeghi. I'm a researcher, graduated from University of Tehran, and I'm based in Isfahan, Iran.
Good to have you. And of course, our YouTube audience, you're already there hanging out. You are our pundits. Do some punditry. Jump into the comment section and you too can be part of the show, not just on YouTube, but also on Twitter. Guess we've got some suggestions for you already. If you want to do an accurate analysis, says Elslam on Twitter, keep in mind these 2 points. Number 1, the US is not looking for a mutual understanding with Iran. Rather, it wants Iran's submission either by force or its carrot and stick diplomacy. Number 2, Iran will never fall for the US's assurances again. Good luck. That good luck is a little ominous. Where should we start? There's something that I want to do, and that is take you back to March 2018, just to revisit what has happened in the last 2-3 years or so. So this is when Trump administration, they left the nuclear deal. January the 4th, Iran resumes 20% of uranium enrichment. And then by February the 7th, that's of this year, US President Joe Biden says that he wants to return Washington the deal, but he hasn't lifted sanctions quite yet. When will that happen? And February 21st, so on Sunday, Iran agreed that the International Atomic Energy Agency could continue limited checks on its nuclear program. So that is where we are right now. But there is a difference in opinion as to who does what first. Do you lift the sanctions first? Or do you stop your nuclear enrichment first, uranium enrichment first? Who goes first? How do you solve that? Setare, from within Iran, what's the perspective?
Well, because we have experience of the US withdrawing from the deal unilaterally and making multiple excuses despite Iran's abidance by the JCPOA commitments and allowing the International Atomic Agency to monitor Iran's nuclear facilities even beyond the normal protocols, and submits to, as President Obama called it, the most rigorous, monitoring regime. The Iranian nation is expecting the sanctions to be lifted first, so that there is some sort of goodwill gesture from the U.S. And Iran can trust US's good faith, and for the deal, and decide to take measures to slow down or stop reversing its commitments as set by the JCPOA.
Jason, I'm just looking at the Foreign Minister's tweet here. US unconditionally and effectively have to lift all sanctions imposed, reimposed or relabeled by Trump. We will then immediately reverse all remedial measures. Who blinks first, Jason?
Well, my hope is that, if the United States blinks, it's the right eye, and Iran blinks, it's the left eye, and that we synchronize our behavior. In this context, I specifically am talking about Iran going back to the centrifuge levels that they agreed to in the JCPOA agreement. They have more centrifuges now than they had during the JCPOA agreement, so they have walked back from their agreement. The second part of this is their low enrichment level has increased from 3.67% to 4.5%. And they ought to consider walking back down to the JCPOA agreed upon 3.67%. It's very disturbing also to see that not only the mention that you said the 20% potential increase that the Iranians are looking forward to, but if you look at the social Twitter feed of the Supreme Leader, he just said yesterday the desire to potentially go up to 60%, and that obviously is very problematic in terms of the JCPOA deal. Certainly things that happened in the Trump administration related to maximum pressure should be unwound in terms of sanctions that relate to the nuclear issue. But these things need to be done jointly at the same time. Iran and the United States need to take these diplomatic steps together at the same time.
Asal, I've got some thoughts here from YouTube. I'm going to run them right by you. PJ says, do both parties agree to de-escalate the tensions?
I think both parties have shown their desire to return to the agreement, and wanting to return to the agreement is obviously a de-escalation from where we were just a few weeks ago when we had a different administration that continuously raised tensions with Iran. So certainly there's a reason to be hopeful. The Biden administration has, even before he was president, when he was a candidate, the Biden administration has signaled that they want to return to the deal. He's brought back a lot of the architects of that exact deal. So you don't bring the people who've negotiated the deal because you're not serious about diplomacy. But I do think, as both Satara and Jason have pointed out, I think that there is a question of how we return to the deal, and we can explore that further.
Here's Ehab, thank you for being part of this program. I'm going to put this back to you again, Asal. It was the US who withdrew from the deal, not Iran. Then it's the US has to lift the sanctions first.
I think that's a valid point. We can't have an honest conversation about something if we continue to just repeat political talking points. The reality of it is, in any situation where parties have agreed to a deal, when one party breaks that agreement, and that in this case it was the United States, then it's sort of logical to expect that party to fix it. But we're not necessarily in an ideal situation. And, while Zarif just tweeted something about, the US has to lift all sanctions and then Iran will return, Zarif also signaled, I think it was just last week, that there's the possibility of a synchronized compliance for compliance return. Ultimately, neither side achieves anything with this stalemate, and neither side wants to lose the agreement. So sort of putting this political posturing on both sides aside and wanting to return, as Jason pointed out, would make the most sense to do it in a synchronized compliance for compliance fashion. That way it sort of avoids the stalemate of who goes first. But, and this is what I said at the beginning, I do understand that point, and it's a valid point. The US broke the deal. And I think right now the narrative has somehow shifted into talking about the fact that Iran is not complying with the deal as if the Trump administration didn't happen, which it of course did. It was the Trump administration. And this was, by the way, President Biden in 2018, in May of 2018, when Trump withdrew from the deal, released a statement saying all of this himself, saying that this decision is a profound mistake, that a unilateral withdrawal of the US will isolate the United States and not Iran. And in January of 2020, after the assassination of General Soleimani, again, it was Biden who made the statement very clearly that it was Trump that quit the deal and not the Iranians.
Let me play a little clip of President Biden. This is from February the 19th. He's talking to the Munich Security Conference. He's basically laying out his thoughts, his foreign policy towards Iran. Setare, come off the back of this comment.
We need transparency and communication to minimize the risk of strategic misunderstanding or mistakes. That's why we said we're prepared to re-engage in negotiations with the P5+1 on Iran's nuclear program. We must also address Iran's destabilizing activities across the Middle East. And we're going to work in close cooperation with our European and other partners as we proceed.
What's going through your mind when you hear that? That's quite a list of how the US is now going to be interacting with Iran. Are you optimistic about this?
Well, not really optimistic because the US's record of breaching agreements and bullying does not signal any hope for me as an Iranian citizen. And also, Biden's reference to Iran's destabilizing, as he calls, activities in the region is another sign that he is the one who is misunderstanding the Middle East politics and Iran's role in the region. I would say he talks a little bit better than Trump, but as for actions, at least it's not very clear at this point that he's going to take any serious action that would be described as against what President Trump did. Biden also needs to, and the European partners needs to understand, as they have, as I also said, that they have been trying to change the narrative and saying that Iran has to go back to the deal when Iran never left the deal. It was the United States that ditched the deal and reversed its commitments. Whatever Iran has so far done, including its starting to reach its commitments, are a part of the JCPOA and what it predicted in case of the breachment of the deal, the possible breachment of the deal by any signatory, and what could happen in reaction to that. So far, Iran has not.
Yeah, this could be quite frustrating for Iranians who are on the ground, who have had sanctions reimposed for them. Let me show you this here. US sanctions inflicted $1 trillion of damage on Iran's economy. That's according to the foreign minister. And then let me show you what that actually means. This is from the International Monetary Fund, and that blue line is the predictive growth for Iran's economy. And then 2017, it's on target. 2018, this is when Trump took the US out of the nuclear accord, and you can see here what the economy has done in Iran. Is this a consideration, Jason, do you think, from the US side about the harm that's being done, not to the political elites in Iran, but to ordinary people, ordinary citizens? Jason?
So, Femi, I think that graphic is quite stark. And the Soufan Center report that we drafted, one of the main points we made was the impact maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration had was on the Iranian people first and foremost, and that the stated objectives of the maximum pressure campaign had failed terribly. It didn't rein in the Iranian nuclear program. And in fact, it's only increased its productivity in terms of the low enrichment uranium and the production of centrifuges. We saw an increase in Iranian proxies carrying out dangerous activities across the globe. In February 2020, we saw a number of hardliners win the parliament seats in the Iranian election. And I'll just say, I'm more optimistic, I'll say, from where I sit today in the United States as it relates to the possibility to reaching an accord than I was a few months ago. And I'll say this in terms of the Biden administration and what they're doing. They're not posturing. They're not over social media talking about things that they can do to Iran. And in fact, I would just say I think some of the posturing on the Iranian side has proven to be a bit problematic when you take it into conjunction with what the United States actually has done. These subtle things, rebuking essentially the Trump administration position on Security Council Resolution 2231, somehow that secondary sanctions should be put in place. The Trump administration said that in 2020, and Biden has pushed back against that narrative. And then they've pushed back against the narrative of restricting, for instance, Iranian diplomatic movement in New York City. And then finally, I think this is really important to note, is South Korea made a really important decision yesterday in saying essentially that they're going to unfreeze assets, nearly $1 billion worth of assets that Iran can have access to. And I'll tell you, that probably did not happen unless the United States, an ally of South Korea, said it was okay. So I would just look at these as very subtle, optimistic, confidence-building measures that I hope Iran recognizes.
I want to bring in the voice of Professor Morandi. Yes, Asal, can I go? You go ahead, and I'm going to bring in Professor Morandi from the University of Tehran. But you go first. Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to add, there's certainly a difference between the Biden and the Trump administration. I don't think there's any question to that. Biden, like we said, wants to return to diplomacy, but it's a question of how we're going about doing it. And the reality of it is, there is a certain amount of domestic pressure on both sides, both the Iranian side and the American side. But the Rouhani administration is taking that pressure on. And for instance, we can see that with what they negotiated with the IAEA to compromise yet again. And that has caused huge backlash amongst Iranian parliamentarians against the Rouhani administration. What I think the Iranian side needs to see is the Biden administration willing to take on some of that domestic pressure, which we have yet to see.
This is really quick. I'm just going to go very quickly to YouTube Saturday. Just a very quick answer back here to JBB. Does Iran need the deal? Explain if it does and then why. Just very briefly, and then we'll move on.
It did when the deal was formed back in 2015, because it wanted to prove its goodwill and that the program, the Iranian nuclear program, is peaceful, and Iran is absolutely ready to engage with world powers to prove that. But right now, if this is going to continue the same way as it has, without any sanctions relief, and with sanctions only relabeled, I don't think Iran really needs such a deal.
I promised you Professor Morandi from the University of Tehran. He spoke to us earlier. Have a listen.
Iranians hate Trump, obviously, but that doesn't mean they like Biden. After all, it was during Biden's vice presidency that the United States initiated the maximum pressure campaign, using sanctions to target ordinary Iranians and making women and children suffer. And people died as a result. So Biden is not a friend of the global South or Iran or the region, but the Iranians are still willing to give him a chance. And so far he's failed, because he's continuing with Trump's maximum pressure campaign, and therefore he's brutalizing ordinary Iranians and still making them suffer.
So far he's failed. So this is from January the 20th. So there's been a month of failure. But also this maximum pressure campaign that happened during the Trump years. Jason, what came out of it?
Not a lot of good, quite frankly. I mean, it definitely hit the Iranian economy extremely hard. We saw a significant decline, like you demonstrated a few minutes ago. But what we also saw was Iran doubling down on a number of things that are extremely problematic in the context of U.S. national security interests and the interests of its regional security allies. And by that, I mean the support to various proxy groups. What we saw in terms of support to groups like the Houthis in Yemen is causing instability there as well. And that's a post-2015 advent. We saw a significant movement of IRGC personnel to prop up the Assad regime, also problematic in the context of U.S. relations. We saw the United States observe that Iran started getting closer to the orbits of the Russian Federation, as well as the Chinese government. The Chinese government, in terms of the economic relationship in terms of Russia, for instance, providing Russia the ability to use Iranian air bases in Hamadan. So these are all things that are inimical to broader U.S. security interests. And of course, we are long aware of the fact that there are certain level of al-Qaeda individuals at pretty senior level who still call Iran home. And that passive support provided by the Iranian regime is problematic, to say the least. I would just go and just add at the end here that I disagree with the Trump administration assessment of the level of the support to al-Qaeda. It's passive support. It is a chip that Iran has, quite frankly, and there has been a past where they're willing to actually consider trading these al-Qaeda individuals living in Iran to the United States. And they offered them up to trade them for the MEK, for instance, the Mujahideen Khalq, about a decade ago. So these are things that are extremely problematic that have become worse because of the maximum pressure campaign. Significant failure of U.S. foreign policy.
Trita Parsi is a friend of the stream. He often weighs in on Iranian issues. He did so today a little bit earlier with a sense of urgency. Have a listen.
The Biden administration ran on a platform opposing Trump's maximum pressure strategy on Iran. They deemed it a total failure that had undermined U.S. national security. It was even written into the Democratic platform that the United States needed to urgently return to the JCPOA. This has not yet happened, and it's not entirely clear why not. But if the Biden administration doesn't move much faster than this, there's a high likelihood that the next president of Iran will be a conservative who will be elected on a platform opposing the JCPOA, just as Trump was in 2016.
Setare, is there this sense of urgency within Iran that something has to be done about the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action? Are you feeling that? Are you sensing that?
Well, everything that the Iranian nation is feeling with regard to its being urgent is the U.S. taking an urgently taking action to return to the deal and to compensate for the damage that it has caused to Iranian nation and the deal. So yes, the Iranian nation is willing to see that, and they're not going to give. They have given enough time to the United States and the other signatories to reverse what they have done so far. Iran took 1 year after Trump withdrew from the deal in order to start reversing its commitments, and it has given the Atomic Agency just recently, after the head of the agency visited Iran, another chance, another time of 3 months time to still abide by the protocols that the agency has set, and Iran has done everything to show that it's willing to continue with the deal if the United States lifts sanctions, if the United States go back to the deal, and of course compensates for what it has done. But it is also important to remember that the Iranian nation has a very bitter memory, a very recent bitter memory of their top general being killed under the Trump administration. They have the memory of the MEK,
Yes.
the terrorist group, being supported and trained by the U.S. government and Mossad to assassinate Iranian nuclear scientists. So it's very difficult to imagine that the Iranian nation would trust the U.S. without seeing anything that shows a little bit of change of behavior from the U.S. establishment.
Do you know what I'm thinking is one of the hardest things is we've been talking around this and who moves first and who does what first, and these maybe little steps towards working out some kind of agreement. But how do you get that done? Reza has an idea.
When it comes to the JCPOA, it's a bit more complicated for the United States and for Iran because there's a balancing act for both countries where on the one side they have to appease to their domestic constituents and their international allies and showing that they're not weak or eager to take that first step. However, it is in their national interest, their personal interest. I also believe their global image to re-enter the JCPOA, which is why I think through back channel diplomacy, there'll be a path for a simultaneous re-entry where both countries can save face.
I am sure we'll be talking about UN-Iran relations in future episodes of the stream, but for now, Setere, thank you. This is where you can find her on Twitter. Asal, thank you very much. This is where you can find Asal on Twitter. And Jason, we appreciated you. This is Jason's Twitter handle. Thanks for watching, everybody. See you next time.